David Lee and his wife, Jimmy Ruth, were missionaries to Colombia, South America.
We took a team to Bogota, Colombia, and this is where the vision for the use of television, not that it was something that just hit me, but it was as I saw what happened. We were staying at a church camp in Bogota. Bogota is a city at that time of about 7 or 8 million, and the national television invited the First Assembly Youth Choir from here in Lakeland to come and sing on national television, which was at Christmas time. After the program was over, I said to the director of the program, I said, how many people do you suppose saw this? My idea was, there would be a few antennas sticking up around Bogota and that would be it. And he said, our average audience for this program is 18 million. And this being the Christmas holidays, and this is a special, I would expect that we had 22 million or more that watched this program. And I thought to myself, wow.
In 1979, the Lees started a daily radio program to reach the millions of people near Medellin, Colombia.
But Brother Triplett had also said, but we've got something else in mind that we want you to do. There was a study committee headed by Ed Nelson to study the needs of missionaries and national churches in the area of media. And they asked me to be a part of that.
God gave Lee a vision for the power of media. The Lees left Colombia in 1980 to help study the idea for a global media ministry.
In May of 1981, the Foreign Missions Board, that later became World Missions Board, made a decision. They said, we would like for you to create a ministry that would relate to the international media needs of the missionaries and national churches around the world. In December of 1981, we were confirmed as the founding directors of International Media Ministries. On January the 1st, we had a paragraph on a sheet of paper, one typewriter, and all of this was in our converted garage, actually here in Lakeland where we're taping this today. And we had the support of World Missions, and we had the promise that Jesus said, I won't give you anything that's too hard for you to do, but I will make it possible for you to do whatever I call you to do. And one scripture that has always stood in my heart and my mind and stood with me during these years is, Jesus said, it's my church and I'm going to build it. I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Come up with a name, and they said, well, it's very apparent. An international ministry to minister to the needs, media needs of missionaries and national churches. International Media Ministries. They said, that sounds good to me. We would train missionaries and nationals to use radio and television, but that wasn't enough just to use it. They said, you've got to help us to produce programs in the language of the people in our culture, in their language, so that they can reach their own people with the gospel of Jesus Christ. So that became our motto, our goal. The reason that we existed was to train the nationals and the missionaries so that they could produce programs, not just us. During this time also, I got a phone call from Brother Hogan, who was our executive director of World Missions, and he said, get your camera, David. I want you to go to China. Now, China had just opened the door just a crack. And I thought, we're taking our lives in our hands to take a camera a video camera and the big old recorders of those days and go into China. God used us all, and the footage that we gathered out of the China trips, we made 3 different feature films. One was China Sunrise, the second was China Challenge, and the third was China Children. And those 3 films helped to awaken the people here in the United States to the needs of China and to help us send workers into China. But on one of our trips to Burkina Faso in Africa, we met Richard Dunn. Richard was working as a missionary and also with radio in Burkina Faso. What a blessing Richard and Sherry have been to International Media Ministries as they help serve right along with us as directors of the ministry.
We joined IMM in 1984, having come from West Africa as missionaries, media missionaries. David Lee made a world tour and saw the tremendous opportunities and needs there were in Africa to use television and radio and other means to share the gospel on that vast continent. And we were invited to become a part of that, and a big part of our ministry in those early years particularly was to help develop television and radio in West Africa and then into Southern Africa. And our very first country that we worked in was in the country of Burkina Faso and then Sierra Leone. Both of these countries had national television time available, but because of the deficiency in their studios, national studios, were unable to produce or edit any of the programs that we're looking for higher quality and a better presentation of the gospel. So IMM sent teams into these countries, and as they went in, they were able to produce the programs, be able to record them, the different segments, the speakers, the music, the offers that were given, and even the invitations at the end of each of the programs. And then they would bring that back to our studios in Lakeland, Florida. That's before we moved to Brussels. And then we would edit those programs in not only English, but also in French and also in the African language called Moray. Then we would send those programs back and they would be aired weekly on national television in the capital cities of those 2 countries. So this was the beginning of IMM working with Africa. It continued to develop over the years. Not only were we there to help in the area of television production, but as IMM had a mandate to also train nationals in the use of the media, television and radio, we worked in that area as well. We sent teams, training teams into different countries, into Swaziland, into Burkina, into other parts of Africa to teach them how to develop their own indigenous television ministry. And that was one of our great goals, not to have a foreigner on camera, but to have us working behind the scenes. Along with that, we also were able to do something in the area of engineering. We had 3 engineers at our peak that were going into Africa, helping us to build radio and television studios. God opened up doors in those years to actually have a national influence and presence in the main cities of several countries. And I'll just give you an illustration of that. In Ouagadougou, we had a television program fully functioning with African technicians, producers, and that went on with regular programming all day long. Then we also helped to produce an FM radio station that was very effective and touched many, many people.
In May of 1985, Brother Hogan asked us to move to Belgium.
Just a few days after that we got to Brussels, Richard and I flew to Nigeria, where we toured the whole country, and we had been invited there by the general superintendent to see their country in the Bible schools and also to help them develop their national television programs. And this was one of the first invitations that we had to get started in the training of nationals. We went to Burkina Faso, and God helped us there. We produced hundreds, and that's no exaggeration, of programs in the two languages, the Maori language, which was Vim Kwega, and the French language, Parole de Vie, which altogether means word of life. And then as time went on, the National Church of the Assemblies of God in Burkina Faso was given the opportunity to open a radio station and a television station, and we had the privilege of helping them build these radio stations and television station. And this has happened in various places around the world.
I think it's interesting to know that one of the early projects that IMM was involved with concerned the Islamic world, Northern Africa, Egypt particularly, where we produced a movie called Thirsty Hearts. It was a team effort with Palestinian, Egyptian, and IMM crews that worked together to produce this movie. And this movie gave a tremendous message in the Muslim world, a story of how Christ can change a person's life, how the gospel has power to make a difference, how it makes a difference in your family, it makes a difference in your own personal life. So we're very thankful to have been a part of that project to touch North Africa and the Islamic world with the gospel.
يعني انت طفشت على اوروبا يا ناجي عشان تدور هناك على اللي ما عرفتش تلاقيه هنا.
Another flagship program that made a lot of stir, particularly in Africa, was a program called Sabina's Encounter. And this particular program has won various nominations, not only in Africa, but in Southern Asia and other places, as it tells a story of a woman who could not have children and the plight that she was in. And this has been used so extensively throughout, particularly Africa. It was used to broadcast before the Jesus film to get a crowd for the Jesus film.
You need to forgive your husband. After.
God placed it on our hearts to develop a children's program in French. This program was called Boulevard des Enfants, or Children's Street. It was filmed in French, had all native French speakers and those that participated in it. This program has been used now for more than 30 years. It has been translated into numerous different languages and is being used in various cultures. And it was so popular that the Vatican bought the programs from us to distribute in their own schools throughout various countries.
More than half the population of Africa today is under 15 years of age. And though we were involved in producing some very important programs, television programs for evangelism, we realized there was a huge number of young people and children that needed to hear the gospel on their level. And so as a result of that, IMM partnered with the Burkina Faso Church to produce a children's program with puppets, with music. And this particular program was aired over a number of different outlets where children could also appreciate on their level the message of Jesus Christ. And we're thankful for that team that helped produce those programs. We had a young man who was actually a drug addict. He found Jesus Christ and became a television producer and a cameraman at one of our local stations. His name was Philippe Remoussin. And he came to IMM one day and said, I really want to produce a program in French for the children of Europe. And so we began discussing that. We did a pilot project with him and began to see that we could produce a program that would be in French and that could be used both in Europe, but then we found out that also Africa was a place that was looking forward and needing a children's series in French. So these programs, there were 36 of them that were produced. We did specials on Christmas and also on Easter, and they covered all of the French African countries, along with many of the countries in Europe that spoke French.
The Oasis programs were broadcast on satellite. As far as we can determine, this was the first Christian series of programs ever broadcast on satellite over the Middle East and North Africa.
Being centrally located in the heart of Europe, Brussels, Belgium, IMM was an ideal location for hosting and training nationals through hands-on internship programs. Throughout the decades, IMM conducted media seminars to teach about writing for radio and TV and production skills. Ministry leaders came, like Pastor Paul Vandenbroek, Vice President of Trans World Radio, and many other groundbreakers who would grow Media Ministries to share the gospel on many continents. In 1991, IMM worked with CBN to produce their animated Bible story series, Superbook, in the Romanian language with 104 episodes, and later also in Russian. When an appeal was made on one of the episodes in Russia for kids to write in, more than 1 million children responded. In 1997, IMM team members Richard and Sherry Dunn and Janet Ivansky-Blakely took approximately 100 sets of Boulevard des Enfants children's programs in Russian, as well as coloring books to regional Sunday school teachers. One teacher traveled across the country to make copies and supply churches with needed materials for kids.
My journey with IMM started when IMM first came to Brussels, and I was not working with IMM. I was working with International Correspondence Institute. And little did I know at that first meeting with David when they were first moving to Brussels, that one day in 1999, I would have the opportunity and privilege to become the director of International Media Ministries. And I'm very grateful for all of the groundwork that was laid by David and his staff, because when I came in, I had big shoes to fill. And the foundation was already built for IMM and its international ministry that reached all around the world. After being at IMM for a couple of years, an event took place that would forever change the history of International Media Ministry. On February the 7th, 2002, we started the day just like we started every day. Members came in from their homes, went to their different areas of work and responsibilities, some in the edit suites, some planning on future shoots, others working toward the agreements we had with broadcast partners around the world, others working in the area of training, where we had media training extension centers in countries from Jordan to Moscow to Denmark, and it was just like any other day until 11 o'clock. And on that day, the building had visitors, and they weren't the normal visitors. These were uniformed gendarmes or Belgian state police that came in, to our surprise, we thought, to ask us a few questions about what we were doing and why we were there. What we didn't understand was that this was going to be a life-defining moment for International Media Ministries. For at that time, they brought about charges that shut our ministry down that were unfounded but lawfully, that we were using volunteers in a way that was illegal at that time in Belgium. By noon that same day, we learned that we would no longer be able to enter into our building and do our daily work. We were cast out of the building that International Media Ministries and the Assemblies of God owned. And in that process, some of the young ladies that were volunteering with us, as well as some ladies at the Christian school across the street, were actually deported following that day. The very next morning, they were put on a plane and sent back to the United States. So that disrupted everything that we had going on. All of the broadcast agreements, all the plans, all the production, all the training, it was all up for grabs at that moment. During the time that we were praying and still continuing to work from our homes, seeking what God would have for the next step for IMM, the executive committee of AGWM asked me to look around for locations where we might be relocated because we were no longer able to get work permits to stay in Belgium. We ended up looking at the suggestion of Greg Mundus in a trip to Madrid. I was able to find out that the National Church was very open to receiving IMM as a new ministry. Being in Spain put us closer to a field that we had been working with some of our broadcast partners into North Africa. And also we had been going into that area in Portugal and Spain to do a lot of the shooting for our Bible stories. So a lot of things seem to be lining up.
In the throes of moving IMM from Brussels to Madrid, there were a lot of hurdles to cross. We discovered that we were going to have to find a place to rent to locate the ministry for the next couple of years until we could sort things out. After a period of time, we found a house. It was a 2-story house with a basement that had ceilings high enough to put some equipment racks in. So we rented the house for 2 years. One night, after all of the team had gone home, and John and I were getting ready to close up the building, close up the shutters before locking up and going to our home, John called me from the upstairs second floor bathroom, and he said, "Ruth, come here, I want you to look at something." And we stood at the bathroom window, this small window looking down into the yard next to us, and it was a vacant yard. And he said to me, "That's the perfect place for IMM to build a building." We stood there, and it was a God moment. It was one of those moments where you know that this is it, that God has put you in a location where you can look and see a glimpse of the future. We stood there and prayed together and said, "God, if it's your will, we claim this vacant lot for you." That was just the beginning, because the vacant lot was not for sale. Over a period of time and some amazing miracles, God put it together, and we began to see that this was going to be the home for IMM. In that process, a pastor and his wife from the United States came to visit. We took them, showed them the lot, and she wrote on a stone in the lot, "I claim this property for the Lord Jesus Christ for IMM." And that today is where Hogar Bueno is located.
As we worked in that rented home, there was an empty lot right next door, and we began to pray and say, "Lord, that would be a perfect place for IMM to land. It's a lot we could build exactly what we wanted on it to fit our own needs and purposes." And the result of all of that was that God did give us that land and gave us the opportunity to build a purpose-built building for the first time in IMM's history. We didn't have to fit into somebody else's building. We didn't have to modify anything. We could build it exactly the way we wanted it. And that ministry center became what's now known as Hogar Bueno, named after John Bueno, who was the executive director of AGWM and was an instrumental part in helping us with some of the funding. And the funding for that building and property is another miracle that took place. For I've never known of another ministry anywhere around the world that was being dislocated, having to move with no place to go, and another field said, "Come here, we've got a building." And when that building didn't work out, they allowed IMM to use the funds that would have gone into that to build its own building. So we had a great head start. Didn't pay for it all, but we had a great head start with the Spanish field, who invested heavily into IMM as well.
Later, in 2008, Jerry Gibson and his wife Gwen came to lead the ministry of IMM.
The challenge of saying yes to IMM was daunting. I remember speaking with John Merrill and trying to put a good face on it. I said, "Well, John, I just love a challenge." He looked at me square in the eye and said, "Well, son, you're going to be in hog heaven." The digital world was changing. Media production was changing. And I felt unprepared, underfunded, and overwhelmed. I guess the transition of staff was probably the most challenging. I've always believed that IMM is who God sends us. And there was one moment, one portion of time where Gwen and I and one other missionary were the only missionaries in the building. And the reality is, I remember saying to God, God, is this just a bunch of smoke and mirrors? But God is not the God of smoke and mirrors. He is the God of strength, and He is the God of hope. But the foundation was strong. You see, in the midst of all the changes, the reality was IMM had not changed its mission. Curating and creating new content, partnering with broadcast outlets, and mentoring and training a new generation in media. It was a great time as we saw God's hand at work.
Never in all my times of reading the story or listening to sermons or participating in those Bible studies had I ever been moved to such emotion. It wasn't just words on the page anymore. It was real people facing horrible hardships, circumstances of heartache, struggling just to survive, and being met by a loving God. That experience really showed me that what we were doing through IMM was going to have an eternal impact that I could not begin to imagine. Incidentally, one of those Spanish actors that we had hired for the Women of the Bible Project was herself so moved by the experience that she gave her life to Christ through the process of the filming.
Millions of people have heard the gospel throughout the world as IMM continues giving the world something worth hearing, something worth watching, and empowering locals to use media. In 2014, Denise and Carrie Godwin began leading the International Media Ministries team.
Stories touch us and reach beneath our defenses to impact the heart. Social media offers a chance to catch someone's eye with a story and begin a discussion. During these 40 years at International Media Ministries, the means of media delivery has changed, the screens have changed, but the purpose remains for hearts to meet the hope of Jesus on every screen possible. Research shows that in the last 30 years, more Muslims have come to Christ than in the previous 1,400 years. It is significant, and God is at work in our times using the media. We need more people to join our team at IMM, to pray and to support IMM. Pandemic conditions have tripled the numbers of people texting, calling, and reaching out to our media partners to talk about Jesus in their own languages. This is the generation that all could hear about Christ. Let's make it happen together.